Welcome to the Lucinda Hickory Research Institute Perspectives in History, telling the stories of the Creek Allotee of Tvlse. What happened to the Mvskoke Creek original Allotee, their families, and their mineral-rich property that made Tulsa, Oklahoma the oil capital of the world, while leaving so many mysterious deaths of our Creek citizens in its wake, and even more impoverished and destitute? I'm Tatiana Duncan, Muscogee Creek, Cherokee native, a descendant of Tuckabache, and the executive director of the Lucinda Hickory Research Institute, where we educate, promote, preserve the history of land allotments of the Mvskoke Creek Allotee so we may share with you the untold story. Hey, Russ.
Hi, Tatiana. Nice to see you.
You too.
Hinsche. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Doing
Yeah,
great. We got a big story to tell in a small amount of time, don't we?
we do. We're really happy to be here with you today. My name is Russell Cobb. I am an associate professor of Latin American Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Alberta, and I am the author of The Great Oklahoma Swindle: Race, Religion, and Lies in America's Weirdest State. I am descended from three to four generations of white oil men who came to Oklahoma seeking their fortunes in the oil industry, and so it is. I feel very honored to hear the stories that were not told when I was growing up of the original owners of the land and the stories that happened to them once oil was discovered. So I'm just really happy to be a part of this. I'm also the vice president of the Lucinda Hickory Research Initiative, and I want to welcome you all and encourage everyone to get involved. We have a Facebook page. We'll have lots of things on the go in the coming months. We're going to be looking at some traveling exhibitions and talking to people and collecting stories. So please get in touch with us after this presentation if you want to know more or be involved. Let's go ahead and just get into this presentation because we know you're here to hear about history. This is for the Oklahoma History Conference, and we're here to discuss uh, a few allottees and what happened to them. Tanya, do you want to go ahead and start and just tell us? Could you tell us a little bit about your ancestor, Tuckabache?
So, Tuckabache is where our story begins in Indian Territory. He was a legend. He not one most people have heard of today, but he most certainly was an important man of his time. Um, when he died March 21st, 1910, the newspaper outlets reported, like the death of Geronimo, the demise of Chukobaji is the passing of one of the famous Indian characters of the Southwest. So Chukobaji was born about 1800 near his ancestral lands of Sugar Creek, Alabama. He was of the Snake Clan, and his tribal town was Logoboja. Tuckabache was a medicine man and warrior, and he came to Indian Territory in 1834 due to the forced removal of the American Indian. He engaged in several tribal conflicts. When the Indians were forced to choose a side for the American Civil War, he fought with the North. Newspaper outlets reported that Tuckabache was 110 years old when he died, although some reports suggested he was 95. My great uncle Jess knew him personally, said he was 107 years old. However old he was, he lived a very long life and saw many unwelcome changes for him and his tribe. He outlived his wife Lena and his children Sarah, Sally, and Ned. Tuckabache was a traditional Muscogee Creek Indian, and as a matter of fact, the day of this recording is the 111th anniversary of the death of Tuckabache, March 21st, 1910. So that kind of sums up Tuckabache for now.
Listening to you talk, it sounds like Tokobachi in many ways embodies a lot of the experiences of Creek people, first on the Trail of Tears and being removed, and then coming to Indian Territory, then forced to deal with allotment. Because one of the probably biggest disruptive events in his life and in many
Yeah.
people in the Creek Nation, not just Creek Nation, but all the five tribes, was this process known as allotment. And for those of you who aren't that familiar with what how tribal land tenure pre Dawes Commission, land was held in common. Uh, Individual families farmed their own plots, and some people rented out land to be grazed upon, and some people actually made a lot of money renting grazing land to Texas cattlemen. But the actual ownership of the land was always held in common. Under the Dawes Commission, and probably a lot of you will know this story already, but it bears repeating that the Dawes Commission really disrupted this type of land tenure, and the tribes pushed back. And in fact, they resisted for many years until, under the Curtis Act, they were forced to allot their lands as well. And that Curtis Act was actually not called technically the Curtis Act. It had a name in it that was absolutely contradictory to what it was supposed to do. It was something like for the protection of the 5 civilized tribes, their land and people. But it was actually, for all intents and purposes, the Curtis Act, who was named after Charles Curtis, who was actually the only Native American person as a vice president. There's a lot of talk that Curtis perhaps didn't want the law to be changed this way, that in fact he was trying to ameliorate some of the circumstances. That's to be discussed at some other time. It's a very interesting point, but for our story, we have to know that when it came through and it was forced into law, that from 1898 to 1905, the congressionally appointed commission was here in Indian Territory, forcing citizens to enroll, and then with their enrollment, they were given 160 acres, known as an allotment, and that takes us to Tuckabache. So at this point, it's incredible because Tuckabache has already gone through 2 of the most traumatic events probably in history. First, the Trail of Tears, and then fighting in the Civil War on the cause of a loyalist, right? He was called a loyal Creeks, was forced all the way up to Kansas. Aid was promised by Abraham Lincoln. It never came. Mm-hmm. Then he comes back, and now he has to live through a third tragedy, which is allotment. And Tanya, can you tell us a little bit about the land, where he picked his land and what his life was like once he lived there?
Sure. So Tuckabache lived on a plot of land for really 65 years, which is today present day gathering place. He was against allotments. He would have been on the side of, say, Kiddo Harjo and the Crazy Snake Rebellion. So, with that said, he was an old man at the time of the allotment era, so he did choose an allotment.
Some of the gathering place overlaps with Tuckabache's land. Some of it overlaps with his son Ned Tuckabache's land, and something very disturbing happens around the years of 1910. Or maybe around 1909 to about 1915, a number of people start dying.
Yeah.
And this is shortly after allotment. It's shortly after allotment and right in the wake, and then the immediate wake of discovery of oil at Red Fork first, which is today it's West Tulsa, and then Glenpool, which is just south of town. So,
oil well you're talking about? Is that what that is?
Yes, those oil wells. Yeah. There was the Ida Glen discovery, and then Glenpool, and then I believe that was 1906, and then Red Fork was a little earlier. Now, a year later, 1910, Tuckabache is a very old man.
He is.
And he is dying, and he receives some visitors, and I think, and Tanya, you can tell us about who these visitors are and what they're asking of him with this on his essentially on his deathbed.
Yeah. So there's these 3, I call it the 3 white men in the will, and there's a reason for that. These are prominent men of Tulsa. John T. Kramer, who was a Tulsa County treasurer at the time. Chaz Grimes, who was in a land and real estate development business. Because I should also say, newspaper outlets reported that Tuckabache had some of the most beautiful and pristine land in Oklahoma. And then, of course, we have M.F. Smith, who wanted to be the executor of Tuckabache's will. All these men said Tuckabache called them out to his cabin to execute a will. Well, what I find peculiar about this is newspaper outlets reported that Tuckabache did not like white customs. And they even went on to say that he wasn't that fond of white people. One headline even read that Tuckabache hated whites. I don't know why that headline needed to be so bold like that, but that's what it said. And I bring this up because of these men saying that Tuckabache wanted them out there to do a will. As you pointed out, when Tuckabache's regiment, I believe it was the 1st Indian Regiment, was told by the U.S. government to go to Kansas to seek refuge during the Civil War, they were essentially left to freeze and starve to death. And he, many soldiers died at that time. And then, of course, we have the Trail of Tears. And let's not forget that the U.S. government broke every treaty they'd ever signed with Tuckabache's tribe. So this is where the papers get he wasn't fond of white customs, white people. So now I'm to believe that Tuckabache invites these 3 white men to his cabin while he's on his deathbed to settle his final affairs in the form of a white custom. No, I don't believe that. I don't believe
Uh,
that.
that's very interesting. While you were talking, I thought I would pull up this this was the article. This was from the Tulsa Democrat in 1910, and the headline was Tuckabache was hater of whites.
Yeah.
And that's how he was being remembered in the Tulsa Democrat, which later became the Tulsa Tribune. And he certainly resented. There were certain things that he did clearly resent. And one of the big ones was the coming of the railroad.
Mm.
The MKT, Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railway, was basically forced an easement onto right through the middle of his land to build what is today the Midland Valley Trail. So if you've ever gone hiking or walking down that trail near Riverside, that went straight through his land, and he was really upset about that because he had not. He said he did not give permission to it. So it's really interesting because now we're talking about the end of his life, and he's once again against his will being forced to participate in this custom. And you have we have these 3 white men there, and then he died. And can you tell us what happened after he died?
So I'll go 1 week before he died. His grandson, Tom Cooney, who also, his land is right there at the gathering place. I believe that's part of it. Tom Cooney marries a white woman, Verbia Cody. I say that. I think Verbia was also a pawn in all this because she was just 16 years old. 8 months later, Tom Cooney is dead at 20 years old. And Verbia quit claims the deed to her land, or to Tom's land, and his interest in the Tuckabache estate to founding father of Tulsa, J.M. Hall. The following year, 8 months to a year later, J.M. Hall quit claims this deed to Sam and Ethel Davis. Sam and Ethel Davis are a notorious couple in my family's history. They were always on the scene as soon as one of our people died, and they were always ready to take their land. Sam and Ethel Davis also contested Tuckabache's will. They said Tuckabache was not in his right mind to be doing a will. And in fairness to them, because Sam was half Muscogee and his wife was white, and Sam was also the brother to Sue Bland, I believe, when we talk about the Sue Bland oil well. But
Which
anyway,
is that's really interesting. These things come around because yes, Sue Bland was the allottee where they found the original strike on the Glen Pool. So I'm assuming that they were very very aware that there was lots of oil. In fact, probably America's biggest field thus far discovered.
um, back to Tuckabache and not being in his right state of mind for a will. Former Mvskoke Creek Chief Legis Perryman, who knew Tuckabache well, said the same thing. He wasn't feeling well, and he also said Tuckabache said he was being abused in his last days. And so did these men who articulated the will, said his eye was very swollen. And I don't know if it was swollen from an infection or Was somebody really physically abusing him to get this land deal from him?
Here,
Regardless,
so you said, so this is from a here, what we're sharing here is part of a testimony that was given. I believe this is Legis Perryman, right?
yes,
Testifying,
yes,
saying that he went to a pretty big, it was, someone had abused him. He said someone went there and disturbed him by shooting off a pistol or aiming to shoot a pistol.
yes.
Right.
And on the slide before is where he says he's being abused. Um, he said that some fellow had been abusing him. That's sad. That's an old Indian man, and by rights, my great grandfather. And he, like I said, he was an important man of his time, and I do wonder where his family was at this time. I almost feel as if they were keeping people away when I see the people that were around him when he died.
You know, something we should talk about, as you mentioned that about where was his family, is this issue of guardianship.
Yes.
And every Oklahoman should be aware of this because the guardianship program in Indian Territory and later the state of Oklahoma was probably might have been the linchpin for these massive transfer of land within a few years. Because essentially, and it's like so many things in history, it begins with good intentions. The
Mm,
intentions were that if you leave everything to its normal devices, land hungry white men will come in and steal by hook or crook Native American land.
yeah.
And so guardians would help protect Native Americans who had just been allotted land, and so that they wouldn't be taken advantage of. But in the words of Angie Debo, in her book, her seminal book on this, on the and still the waters run, she said this was a vast criminal conspiracy. And so when you're talking about the children and the grandchildren,
Yeah.
I, I'm thinking of these guardians who often had hundreds of wards, who were in league with the oil men, and who did absolutely the contrary of what their mission was, which was to protect the best interests of their wards.
It really does appear that way that they abuse these. Well, they abuse the U.S. government policies, although the U.S. government policies were in themselves, I don't know, would you call it? They were unfair to the American Indian. It took away their power and their right to make their own decisions and to live their life. So so to finish off Tuckabache's will real quick, the land or his estate, the land ended up selling in April of 1917 for $52,400, which I think you had on earlier. Each one of the children, and remember at this point Tom Cooney's dead, and all the adults are dead at 1917, and we'll go back to how. And so each one of the children got $14,714 apiece. The day after the estate sold, the guardian, Dr. J.C.W. Bland, just starts doling out the kids' money. This financial record I'm talking about is Sally Hickory's. Here, Bland doles out to C.D. Miller real estate loan $2,000. Lewis B. Wood Realty, two loans, one for $3,000, one for $5,000. Already we're at 10 grand. James H. Sykes, 1,500, which I should point out when we think that Tom Cooney's marriage was kind of set up. James H. Sykes witnessed the marriage of Tom Cooney to the historically speaking white woman. So I think that's important to mention. He's a notorious person in our family's history, as well as Sam and Ethel Davis and J.C.W. Bland. And then, of course, Grimes, Williams, Davidson, all those got paid $400. And some money went to Sally Hickory for her school and education, and they put $1,000 for Thomas Hickory. They always was charging money in the name of Thomas Hickory. And in the end, Sally got $87.98, which I seriously doubt they handed to her. That just forwarded to the next financial report. Sam Hickory's is almost identical, except he got more like 800. And we've not been able to find the financial records of Luwina Hickory. So that's what happened with the Tuckabache estate. And I never see the money's returned sometimes, but land sends it right back out. I never see where the family themselves ever got any type of payment for this Tuckabache estate.
So to kind of back up a little bit, we have um, you have when Tuckabache passes on, you have a number of descendants
Yes,
uh, who he puts in his will, and yet when you look at the actual land, that 160 acres plus the other 160 acres of Ned Tuckabache,
that's right.
um, by 1914, this land is starting to be developed, and we
Okay.
see the development is not coming from the Allottees or any of their family. It's coming from some of the oilmen we discussed before.
Yes.
Now, what and just to put this in dramatic context, it wasn't just any old land.
No.
This particular land became Tulsa's most exclusive neighborhood, Maple Ridge, and it was where they've been called one of those streets through there is called Black Gold Row. It's where the uh, wealthy built their oil mansions. It's where the Skelly Mansion is to this day. One of the first Tulsa pioneers, Grant Stebbins, built a mansion there, and Stebbins, I discovered, was instrumental in another case that is just horrifying when you read the details of a little girl named Millie Naharkey who had received an allotment almost right across the river from Tuckabache. It's actually a little bit further south where the like at the base of Turkey Mountain. And Millie Naharkey was a teenager when a lot of this was going on, when a lot of the Tuckabache and stuff was going on. And so she saw what was happening and said, there is no way, I am going to sell. I'm not going to get involved in this at all. But I think this early experience that we're talking about here in 1910, 19 teens, had really forced white people to actually engage in even more and more nefarious forms of intimidation and bullying.
Absolutely.
So Naharkey, when she actually comes of the age of maturity, it's not till 1923, and to force her into selling the land, she was actually abducted and, like they say these days, gaslit. Told that she was being pursued, that she needed to drink. They gave her copious amounts of alcohol against her will in a resort in Missouri, and was reportedly raped by an OU student, actually,
Oh wow.
until she finally said, I'll sign it. I'll sign it. Just give me the papers and I'll sign it."
Yeah.
That was a scheme that went all the way to Grant Stebbins, who ran an oil company. So these people and what they built in Tulsa is is a crime. But hope that Tanya can share
Yeah.
more about this, some of the other family
So,
members, and
yeah,
you can see
because
how this went down. Yeah.
like you
Mm-hmm.
said, Millie saw what was going on, and I think because of people like this, because when you look at the allotments, they weren't too far apart. But April 27th, 1912, the Tulsa World reported the Galbraith test is complete on the Lucinda Hickory, section 16, 19, 13, southeast of Kendall College, and is good for over 20, or is good for 20 millions of gas, which if, it appears there's quite a gas field over there, which of course is worth a lot of money for the city of Tulsa, right at her door. Well, I always like to point out that the Lucinda Hickory wasn't a piece of land. She was a young Muscogee girl, just 13 years old, the heir and great granddaughter of Tuckabache, and dead 8 months after gas was found on her land. And that's, as bizarre as that is, what makes this completely devastating is the day of her death, the general warranty deeds that were filed in Tulsa County Courthouse by 5 o'clock p.m., taking this mineral rich property from the family and putting it into the hands of, again, Sam and Ethel Davis. So, what I think is important is that this property is marked with no more than an X and a thumbprint because the parents of Lucinda Hickory, Jenny and Thomas, did not speak English. They didn't read English, and they really didn't even understand the concept of land ownership. They were just trying to learn this stuff. Land ownership is not a belief of Native American people. I think people in Tulsa honestly weren't fond of what happened. They probably were hoping to get that land themselves. That because that was a pretty mineral rich piece of property. So a month later, the Hickorys are pulled into court on a competency hearing, um, because I guess the Tulsans, they thought these Davises had too much influence over the Hickorys, so they wanted to declare them incompetent. The Hickorys had a statement that said, "We are we are competent and we do not wish to have a guardian." And the court testimony asked them a lot of questions on more of the white man's way of life that they would not know anything about. Unfortunately, that trial did not go well for them, and from that point forth, they are now known as Jenny and Thomas Hickory Incompetent. So, what happens to an Indian couple when they're declared incompetent? They remove the children from the home. The two oldest girls, Luwina, who is my grandmother, and Sally, are sent to a Catholic Indian boarding school in Priscilla, Oklahoma, St. Elizabeth. And the little boy, um, Sammy Hickory, is sent to board with a woman, Mrs. Sally Morrison, in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. So now I have to ask myself, what is the Hickory household like now? Jenny and Thomas, the parents, are grieving the death of their daughter, and their other children are no longer in the home. So I would think it was a pretty sad household, you know. And then they have guardians they have to deal with now. 2 years, almost to the date of the death of Lucinda Hickory, her mother, Jenny Hickory, is now dead. And that makes her land vulnerable for sale. And what makes her land so critical? That's where they built their four room dwelling, their barn, where they cultivated their land. That was their home. So now that Jenny's dead, the children are at boarding school. Bland orchestrates the sale of Jenny Hickory's land, of Thomas Hickory's interest, to his children. Did that make sense how I said that? Bland orchestrated the sale, so Thomas Hickory was selling his interest in his wife's land to the children. And you ask yourself, why would he do that? With Thomas Hickory out of the way, there are no longer any adults with any legal interest in Jenny Hickory's land. And now Bland is in charge of it. And with the kids in boarding school, he files alienation of allotment. And then Bland proceeds to sell the land, which again, I remind you, is their home.
Tanya, if I can just jump in there, it's incredible. Again, another policy when you talk about
Yes.
alienations, which were about removing restrictions,
Yeah.
and again, the restrictions were supposed to be there to protect, but actually, what they did was they just attracted more and more grafters, as they were called, swindlers. Some of them were bankers, some of them were lawyers. Um, JCW Ban was actually a physician, I believe, by trade,
Yeah.
but they all just saw this as an opportunity to control. And so the alienation was like you can't. The federal government was saying, no, you can't just sell this land from a Native American person to a white person. There, and so they put these restrictions on there, but they could get past these restrictions all the time. The newspapers of this time are full of just hundreds of names every day that are where the restrictions are being lifted. Once you have a guardian, there's no more restrictions. They can divide, sell, uh, do whatever they want with the land, and they also reward themselves. Is another thing that just
Yes, I did.
blows me away when I look at some of your records that you've put together, and then the records of Millie Naharkey. It's bad enough that they're committing basically an unethical, a crime, a legalized crime, and it's certainly unethical move. Then they're going to go ahead and pay themselves for doing that.
And then, I
Let's
mean,
go ahead.
then the Dead Indian Act also goes hand in hand with removing those restrictions because once a native died, the heirs could sell their land. But as we see, the heirs weren't the ones selling the land, it was the guardians out from underneath them. And in this case, it was Jenny's home at 31st and Lewis, where, there are very fine homes there today. So while Blanche, you want me, yeah, so while Blanche's trying to sell this land, Luina comes home from boarding school and makes a statement in court. And she says, "My name is Luina Hickory. I'm a sister of Sally and Sammy Hickory. We are the heirs of Jenny Hickory, deceased. We are the minors whose lands are attempting to be sold by the guardian at this time. Sally and I are attending the convent school at Purcell, Oklahoma. Sammy is staying with Mrs. Sally Morrison near Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I am 15 years of age. I have been attending school at Purcell for the last 4 years. Sally, Sammy, and I inherited this land from my mother, Jenny Hickory. I would like to hold the land. I don't want the land sold. I am the oldest one of the miners who owns this land. I talked with my mother in regard to this land before she died." 3 days later, Tulsa County sells their land. Regardless, the Hickorys were not going to accept this decision, so they took it to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. The Oklahoma Supreme Court says you cannot sell the restricted land of Jenny Hickory, deceased. And you should have listened to this young Indian girl who's close enough to age to where her statement was relevant. So the Oklahoma Supreme Court overturns the decision. The Hickorys go back home where they're greeted with strangers. Thomas Hickory said, "There are people there that I do not recognize and they're running us off from our property." So while J.C.W. Bland didn't sell the property at that time, he most certainly never let them back in their home. He leased their property out. So now the Hickorys are homeless, impoverished, and destitute because he spent up all their money.
So this is incredible. You have with the children, with the grandchildren,
great grandchildren here.
Great grandchildren. Now they basically still have, with this court decision.
Yeah.
They should legally have the land, and not only some land, but some of the richest land in Tulsa, and yet they're homeless. Do you know more? Do you know much about what the conditions were like at that point? Like where did they, like who was there, and what was going on that made their lives so difficult?
I talk about the Hickory household in 1913, but what about Thomas? He lost all of his kids and his wife, and these men of Tulsa, that he's a huge target. 1920, I think he was an attorney, John Wakely.
Mm-hmm, yes.
He tries to advocate for Thomas Hickory, whether he's trying to do a good deal, because one document said he wanted 45% of anything he retrieved. But then another document, he went to the average attorney swindle of 33%. So, yeah, but Wakely lists this whole list of property that has been mismanaged by the guardians and all. There was a list of them. You had Tuckabaches, Tom Cooney, Liza Cooney, who we haven't even mentioned, which honestly I don't think that was really going to be their property anyway. But regardless, he made up a whole case of why these properties were mismanaged.
Oh, I think this is part of his complaint right here, right? Yeah.
Yes, that's where.
Okay. Yeah, this record of conveyance of Thomas Hickory to the miners in the excuse me. Checks given in consideration there speak for themselves. The homestead portion of the allotment of Jenny Hickory is restricted, and under the Act of Congress is set apart for the use and benefit of two minor children, Sally and Sammy Hickory, both born since March 4th, 1906. Luina Hickory was old enough to receive an allotment. The guardian of these minor heirs leases this homestead from year to year. The minors are in school every year and are being supported from their respective estates. These minors at the present time have each in the neighborhood of $20,000 in cash, first mortgages, loans, and government bonds. Thomas Hickory is an improvident Indian and lives from rentals from his own allotment and with what he is able to earn from his own efforts when he is sober and inclined to work. Uh, there's, you know, the patronizing attitude,
Yeah.
you know, and it's in a legal document, and they have to, you know, I think that a lot of times, and you see this, and this is even in documents of people that are supposedly advocating for them, and this is the thing that just has blown my mind researching this, is that sometimes I come across a lawyer's document who is supposedly working in defense of the Indian, and essentially what they're doing is they're not really defending the person. They're not defending the person or their land. They see an angle to make themselves rich, and most they will at the drop of a hat um, use prey on these stereotypes
Yeah.
and these this racist notion that the people don't are not improving the land, and so a white person needs to manage it for them. That you'll see this over and over again.
And then what I see is, first of all, the hypocrisy, because these men that are accusing him, I guarantee you they're living off of our wealth, and Thomas Hickory can't live off the rentals of his property. And then you know how I feel, they always want to talk about his drinking. He was a grieving man. He lost everything, including his way of life. And the point of the Dawes Act was to separate the Indians and to make them white, and they had to live among white people. So he really didn't even have his community. And then, of course, with the weakening of the tribal government due to the Curtis Act, they were just trying to make a life for themselves in this new changing world. They were forced to assimilate, but they were doing it. Tribal leadership, I read, a lot of them understood that if they wanted to be part of the world, they were going to have to change with it reluctantly. And that's all the Hickories were doing. And then the whole Tulsa community, the greedy grafters, wouldn't leave them alone to just live life in peace. They weren't trying to hurt anybody. They were just trying to farm, and raise their kids. And that just did not happen. They took everything from them. Thomas, yeah. So,
Just wanted to say that when you look at this, the bigger picture, if we zoom out, is that I think it is somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of the allotments in the Tulsa area, what is
yeah,
today Metro Tulsa, had passed from their original allottees to white hands within 10 years. And that's extraordinary. I mean, that you would think that something like that, if this was really if it really worked the way they said it was going to work, this land
yeah.
should have stayed in those families' hands for generations.
And I'd be the mayor.
Um,
I'd probably be the mayor of Tulsa. You can add more to that.
and
Yeah,
I would have grown up leasing land,
yeah,
leasing land from you actually, because I grew up. We didn't talk about this, but part of the reason I'm so passionate about this history is I grew up in what would have been Tuckabache's allotment. Actually, it's kind of it's almost like a gives me a shiver down my spine when I recall it. But the family cemetery where many of the Hickories were buried, it was one block away from my childhood home on
yeah.
28th and Cincinnati. And I just and then the constant harassment of that family and their descendants didn't even finish after they were dead. And that kind of brings us maybe to the last chapters in 1921. And I'm sure we all know the other story about Tulsa in 1921. Uh, Around that same time, the that land was becoming subdivided and platted for individual homes. Um, and so to make way for that, the entire family burial plot was excavated, and Tuckabache was reburied at Oaklawn.
Right.
So, yeah,
But his area that they gave was not enough for everybody that was on Tuckabache's land. So as you know, we have a GPR study. Mvskoke Creek Nation is looking at it, and hopefully we'll have answers in a month or two as to, you know, the best that they can tell us how many people might be there and that type of thing.
yeah. So, we're happy to go ahead and I hope
And
there's some questions out
yeah,
there.
and real quick, You have the picture. The lady closest to the feather is Sally Hickory that we spoke of her financial record. She was my great aunt. And the gentleman is Tom Hickory that went through, I can't even fathom how much he went through. He died at 71. He was hit by a drunk driver.
Now, didn't he lose a leg at some point?
He did lose a leg, and I am really going to research that. They said he laid on a railroad track. He fell asleep on a railroad track and it was cut off. And of course, I've seen other documents where he might have had a leg injury beforehand and he laid on the railroad track to cut it off because it was no good. I don't know that. I'm trying to find that out. And then Luwina
Yeah,
Hickory, my grandmother, is the other woman
on the
that
right
made it.
there.
Yeah, that made the court testimony. When you drive by Jenny Hickory's allotted land today at 31st and Lewis, you see very, very fine homes. Here's her realtor sign that says .65 acres, $899,000. When I saw that, I just stared at it a bit and I thought, so this family, this young Indian family was displaced. They wreaked havoc on the whole family to make way for wealthy Tulsans. They were homeless, they were penniless, and no regard was ever given to Thomas Hickory or his family, and no regard is given to them to this day. As a matter of fact, the men of Tulsa had the nerve to mock Thomas because they said he wanted to live off the rentals of his land. He didn't want to work, he wanted to drink. Well, let me think about it. He did work. He built a farm for himself. They took it. He made a family. They took it. He built a home. They took it. He had wealth and they took it. Yet they have the audacity to be perplexed because old Thomas Hickory don't seem to want to do nothing. I feel like the Hickory story is the epitome of what happened to Creek Nation. From the mysterious untimely death to the marrying of a white person and ending up dead months later, to having other people spend your money, to having the guardian sell your land right out from underneath you and sometimes your home. Because as the guardian would say, it's in the best interest of the allottee. So,
Wow.
and then, yeah, before we take questions, you've said it, I've heard everyone say that. Once you know the allotment history, you never see Oklahoma the same.
Well, I will go ahead and wrap this portion up. Um, my name is, as I said, I'm Russell Cobb. I'm the vice president of Lucinda Hickory Research Institute, and I've been in conversation with Tatiana Duncan, who's our president and CEO of Lucinda Hickory Research Institute. And as you can tell, our primary mission here is to tell the story of these Creek allottees whose experiences have been erased and suppressed in the building of Tulsa as the oil capital of the world. But we certainly feel that it's important for everyone, especially Creek people, but also everyone who happens to be living on the land to know and to honor
Yeah.
these stories. So we welcome your questions at this time. We have a question from Pogie Freeman. Did J.C.W. Bland have other wards, or were the Hickories the only ones?
So I know he has own children because his own children were half Muscogee, or not even half because his wife Sue Bland wasn't even a full blood. I don't think. I know they were considered his wards, and I haven't seen a lot of other people yet.
Some of the Guardians, I don't know so much about J.C.W. Bland, but I know that some of the Guardians would have upwards of 300. I've heard there was one in particular who had 300 wards. He
Wow.
obviously wouldn't have known them. Some of them were missionaries, and they couched their misdeeds in this savior rhetoric. They were doing this to help them because they were incompetent and incapable of managing their own affairs. Um, yeah, so we have another question here. Where can you get the court record transcripts for court cases like you have shown? it's it's not nearly as straightforward as one would hope. You would think you just go to the courthouse and request the court transcript, and there you have it. But it's not doesn't generally work that way. Tanya, can you talk about some of your experiences trying to track down these court records?
I got a lot of my a lot of my records from Fort Worth, the National Archives. And then, of course, we discussed a huge warehouse, right? That's in Tulsa.
I found a lot of them at the National Archives for the Southwest, which is housed in Fort Worth. And fortunately, they do have a lot. They do have a lot of court records. If it's anything federal, right? But that's just federal. And really, the big swindle in Oklahoma was happening on the state and county level. Let's see. We have another. I think it's another question here about the mission of Lucinda Hickory Research Institute and what it will do to help people who want to research their family allotments.
We we are we are starting an Adopt a Lottee campaign, but for curious Tulsans or people that want to know more, they can provide a donation, and we would focus on that allotment. But the mission of our institute is honestly to research the lands that made Tulsa. I grew up with the knowledge of our land was stolen, but that was it. That's all I knew. And then once JD kind of introduced me to it, I just became very compelled to know more. And I was very surprised what I found out. I've heard other Mvskoke Creek say, well, that happened to my family, or I always heard we had land in Tulsa. The reality is you probably did have land in Tulsa, and it's something that to check into. Not that they always tell me there's nothing we can do about it today, but we can at least get some justice in the court of public opinion.
The story of Tulsa is, if you will permit me, whitewashed entirely by the rhetoric of oil. Oil made Tulsa wealthy, and it did. But it would not have been possible. And every time I try to wrap my mind around it, I feel, to be honest, I feel a little mix of guilt. I think because there's no way this could have happened without a violation of what the intent and the letter of the law was. And I think the most shocking moment for me, for example, and I think this is part of what we want to encourage is to really go back and read the history for itself, is to get away from the way it's described and to get out. I know we're all happy to work with people, Creek people, descendants of Allottees or Tulsans who just want to know more about the land they inhabit, and find abstracts. The abstract and title companies really don't want those circulating in the world. They're very unique documents that are often kept under lock and key. And I only got mine when my mother died a few years ago, and she had a cottage in Maple Ridge. But after she passed away, that I had to go look at the abstract, and then that's when I started to see the names. And she had a realtor friend, and she said, "Oh, there's a cloud in if you want to sell this, there's a cloud in the title because of the dead Indian." And that's when I came across the name Tuckabache, and I said, I don't think it's the dead Indian. I think there's an actual name, and I think we need to know that story. So just to wrap this up, and echo what Tanya was saying, is we really want to know those stories. We think it's important for everyone to know those stories and then to honor them.
I definitely am a big advocate on telling it from a Muscogee point of view, because I don't think our voice has been heard from our point of view. So that's a really big point for us.
All right. Well, I just want to say thank you, Mado.
So, Mado.
Yeah.
I'm Tatiana Duncan, founder and executive director of the Lucinda Hickory Research Institute, where we educate, promote, and preserve the history of land allotments of the Mvskoke Creek Allottee so that we may share their untold story. I'm currently building my team of volunteers, and I'm looking for people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and help tell the stories of the Creek Voices of Tvlse. LHRI is predominantly Native American, and we tell our stories of the allotment era from our Native perspective. Although I do have a diverse team that have a passion for this history, and I'm looking for more volunteers who wish to be part of our mission. If you would like to know more, please contact me at lucindahickory1913@gmail.com or message me on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Lucinda Hickory.